Seoul, South Korea. Currently, Seoul had entrusted its future to one single person. The city was in shambles, the asphalt was broken into pieces, and the multi-story buildings kept falling apart one by one. On the pieces of asphalt on one knee sat a guy who had blonde disheveled hair. He was wearing a white suit and a white cloak with gold ornaments. There was a red halo around his head, his eyes were amber-colored, and he had a tie hanging from his white turtleneck. He had light, almost transparent skin, he was covered in sweat, the guy was trying to catch his breath. This is Xie Chuan, he is the Yonghua Guild Master. Next to him, there were unconscious civilians, a guy and a girl, lying on the pavement. Standing nearby was a skinny tall guy wearing a black tech suit with dark hair and a hood. Xie Chuan was still trying to stand up and was breathing heavily. They had a battle, watched by ordinary people who were shocked by this cruel sight, their faces expressing hopelessness and fear. A young guy in a white t-shirt said he couldn't believe what was happening. The guy in the black suit spat blood carelessly, his whole face covered in scratches. He got into a fighting stance, in his hands he held large blue lighted knives. Despite his thinness, he was quite sturdily built, his shoulders and chest also had blue illumination on them. He looked at Xie Chuan aggressively and told him that they were finally alone because they were the only ones left. His name was Kang Hu and he was a public enemy of the world. Xie Chuan was exhausted, his whole body trembling with fatigue, and he struggled to get to his feet. His fancy white suit was stained and torn. He turned to Kang Hu and said that because of this meaningless fighting he started, everyone is suffering. He shouted that Kang Hu was the ultimate evil and all the destruction around was only because of him. In a fit of rage, he shouted louder and began to prepare to attack, concentrating red lightning-like energy in his hands. Scarlet light began to illuminate everything around him. Kang Hu coldly looked at him while grinning and said that this was all very funny. The corners of Kang Hu's mouth showed faint traces of blood. He asked Xie Chuan who he thought he was. Was he a messenger of justice and fairness? His words truly surprised Xie Chuan. His pupils narrowed and he stared into the void. Kang Hu's speech angered him so much that he began to concentrate his energy even more, which completely surrounded him from head to toe. Xie Chuan shouted Kang Hu's name and asked how dare he talk about justice. Kang Hu at this time was covered in a dark blue and purple aura, preparing to attack. In response, Xie Chuan adopted a fighting stance and shouted that he was fighting on behalf of everyone. The crowd felt anxious, everyone was frightened and didn't realize what was about to happen. A little boy clung to his mom, crying and screaming in fear. Chen shouted at his enemy for always getting in his way and asked who he was if he wasn't pure evil. The crowd started cheering and supporting Xie Chuan, shouting his name time after time. All the people were cheering for him. The crowd included school children, office clerks, and utility workers. Although they were all different, they were now united in order to keep Xie Chuan from dropping his arms. He walked proudly and enthusiastically towards Kang Hu, feeling the support of the townspeople. A translucent red magic circle aura with various characters appeared in his hands, which he directed towards Kang Hu. Xie Chuan shouted as he released the energy that for as long as they cheer for him, he will not be taken down at any cost. Kang Hu didn't think that Xie Chuan was so strong. He didn't expect that his attack would catch up with him so quickly that he didn't even have time to take a defensive posture. He only managed to cross his arms and stare at the flying red wave of energy with discouragement. A deafening explosion sounded. Dust from the destroyed houses and roads rose into the air, and people started running away and screaming. Kang Hu was kneeling at Xie Chuan's feet. The guy in black was exhausted, his nose and mouth bleeding. At this time, Xie Chuan stood majestically in front of him. His scarlet halo became brighter and red crosses glittered around him. Xie Chuan's cloak and sleeves were developing in the wind. Kang Hu's face was covered in sweat and scratches, his forehead was pierced and bleeding, and he struggled to open his eyes. At this time, the crowd was cheering, letting out cheers, thinking that the whole nightmare was over. A young family consisting of a father, mother, and infant child rejoiced that they were now safe, and a young boy in a blue hoodie shouted to Xie Chuan that they had always believed in him. The crowd started screaming and begging for Kang Hu to be finished off. They raised their fists aloft and cheered Xie Chuan on. They were asking to kill the guy in black. Amidst all the hateful cries, Xie Chuan moved closer to the kneeling Kang Hu and told him that no man wanted him alive. His face at this moment was haughty and proud. His dirty and ruined clothes did not prevent him from looking majestic and heroic at this moment. He raised his right hand up and began to prepare again for an attack that was supposed to be stronger than the last one. Magical purple circles began to form in his palm, and in the middle was a transparent sphere of energy. Kang Hu rested his hands on his knees and grinned. His body was exhausted and his legs were shaking. He looked at Xie Chuan hostilely, waiting for his demise. Before attacking, Xie Chuan said that this was the end for Kang Hu. He directed the full force of his attack right into Kang Hu's face, causing him to fly into the air and shards of asphalt flew in all directions. Kang Hu started coughing up blood, his face full of hatred. He fell onto the entire asphalt, and then the shockwave rolled backwards a few meters, breaking the road. He looked at Chiechuan, who was majestically standing 5 meters away from him. Kang Hu was slowly losing consciousness from the impact. Chiechuan rose into the air and joyfully announced that all their preparations had finally borne fruit. He raised his right hand up, snapped his fingers, and said with a blissful face that now perfect freedom shall descend upon this land. A young boy in the crowd folded his arms across his chest and began to weep with happiness, while a grown man with glasses also began to weep and rejoice. Chiechuan began to laugh, rising even higher. Runic red symbols appeared around him, rising into the sky along with the Yunhua Guildmaster. The entire area was illuminated with a mysterious red glow. All the destroyed houses and highways were dyed scarlet. The evening clouds began to darken ominously, turning black and maroon in color. Suddenly the sky became even darker, plunging the entire city into bloody darkness. The clouds formed a huge funnel, from which thunder was heard. Rare lightning bolts illuminated the darkened city. A huge hand that could easily hold several people began to emerge from the funnel. On the fingers of this hand were long black claws like an animal. The hand descended lower and lower, coming closer and closer to Chiechuan. The people who were previously rejoicing at the end of the nightmare and cheering Chiechuan up instantly changed in their faces. The girl's tears flowed and the man with glasses' jaw dropped. They couldn't move from their seats in terror and fear. Chiechuan's face looked truly insane. His pupils were narrowed, his mouth was twisted in a wicked smile that showed his teeth, and his eyebrows were raised and frowned. As the hand descended from the distraught Chiechuan, the townspeople helplessly ran away in panic, pushing each other and shrilling. Chiechuan lowered himself to the ground and gazed joyfully at the hand emerging from the funnel, which was getting closer and closer. Chiechuan shouted that the Demon King has descended and now true peace shall begin. Before he could finish the last words, he was interrupted by Kang Hu, who was lying on the rubble of the ground. He didn't have the strength to stand up to the villain, but he said that it was more like true tyranny. It hurt him to speak and breathe, but he couldn't look at such hypocrisy. Chiechuan turned around at his voice and called his name fiercely. Chiechuan asked how he was even alive and, calling him a pathetic insect, told him to open his eyes wide and look at the world he had created with his own hands. His madness had reached its ultimate point. He laughed hysterically and blurted out in his own frenzy. The veins on Chiechuan's face swelled with tension and constant screaming. Planet Earth was blown up and destroyed, the glare from his explosion illuminating the eternally cold and empty space. The fragments of the planet scattered across the stratosphere and beyond. That was how the world was destroyed. All the events that took place turned out to be the story of a writer who thanked the readers of his story on the site for all the love and support they gave to the story The Life of Villain Turned Savior. The guy kept typing something on the keyboard in the dark, only the dim light of the monitor faintly illuminating him. He visualized in his head that the reader's expectations must have been crushed. He visualized in his head a stained glass window that had begun to shatter from above. From the top, the stained glass window was in red and gold colors, and in the middle it looked more like the night sky, the moon, and the stars. At the very bottom, the stained glass ended with arms made of gold that held the entire composition. Below were dark and scarlet shards of stained glass. Continuing his reflections, the writer said that the protagonist, Chiechuan, was a henchman of the Demon King, and he and his comrades, the 13 stars, were top-level, long-standing evils. After the stained glass window, he visualized the image of the protagonist, Chiechuan, who was looking at him in a deceptively kind manner, his thick lashes slightly covering his eyes, and a slight smile on his face. His appearance below was just as shattering as a fragile stained glass window. In reality, the author was sitting on an office chair in front of a wide monitor that illuminated a dark room. It was 9 p.m. on the clock. The entire short story was a mirror reflecting the author's reality. This short story was based on his high school life. He remembered laying a white chrysanthemum to a morning photo of a young boy. In the photo he was wearing his school uniform and smiling. In that moment he saw the power that can even cover up school violence, and the unvarnished, true face of the world, the power that can change the places of good and evil. At the funeral, there were laughing students, one of whom resembled his character Chiechuan in appearance, furtively looking at the author, smiling. This student may have been the basis for the character who was initially portrayed in the story as a messenger of goodness and justice, but turned out to be the ultimate villain at the end. For this reason, he had to put that reality into the novel. The author stopped typing and started reading something. On the page of his novel there was a rating of 2 out of 5, and users wrote unflattering comments asking what was wrong with the ending. A second commenter said that such people with writer's syndrome should be banned from writing short stories, and a third commenter wrote that he would like the author to be the main character and said that for that to happen, the author should die first. All of these comments were topped, with many people replying to them. The author kept scrolling through the comments section more and more, but eventually he bit his lip in anger and realized there was nothing he could do about it. He hovered over the browser close button and clicked it. He didn't bother to turn off his computer and sat down on his bed. His room was in a terrible state and was littered with empty food boxes, crumpled sheets of his work, books and other things lying on the floor. He lay on his bed tiredly and started to remember the other comments. The first user angrily asked why the author had decided to leave the ending open. The second wrote that the author was the kind of guy who brags with his arms crossed in real life, and the third called him a henchman for destroying the reader's world. The writer sadly covered his eyes with his hand, barely holding back tears. He hissed with irritation and anger, opening his mouth. It seemed to him that everything was wrong, because he couldn't even rewrite anything now. The monitor dimmed from inactivity, the room illuminated only by the soft moonlight. The boy lay on his bed, silently staring up at the ceiling. He decided it was best to just go to bed now. In his sleep, he began to get a dim picture that was hard to make out at first. He didn't understand why it was so noisy. The picture started to get clearer and brighter, as if he was slowly opening his eyes and concentrating. He saw many prisoners in blue uniforms mining blue crystals with a pickaxe. When he fully awoke, he realized that he was lying on the cold stone floor, wearing a blue uniform like everyone around him, but it was stained and worn. There was a shout behind the workers. A guard was insulting someone and saying something about Eclipse's grace. A man was angrily and aggressively kicking someone with wheat-colored blonde hair who was lying on the ground and trying to cover his face with his hands. The writer was puzzled and surprised by the guard's phrase about Eclipse. The guard meanwhile continued to kick the young man mercilessly, hitting him in the knees, stomach and arms with his heavy boot. The writer imagined it was like a replay of a moment from the past when his classmate in school uniform, who had died, had been kicked by someone in the same way. His face was in a cold sweat, saliva was running from his mouth, he felt as if he wanted to disappear. The guard reminded him of someone from his past who was responsible for the boy's death. He was angry because he didn't want to dream about that man. The guard held the poor man by the collar and swung his fist, shouting at him that they were all useless and he had better start working. But suddenly someone shouted loudly that otherwise he was finished. The guard's hand stopped abruptly and trembled. Everyone turned around to see someone at the back of the work field. The writer wondered who it was. The guard's face abruptly changed from aggressive to confused, and his fist hung in the air like that. But exactly a moment later, the guard started punching the young man in the face again, shouting at him that he was pathetic and useless because he couldn't last even 1 second. The author thought about why he was in so much pain, why he felt such suffering even in his sleep. The second guard, a man with stubble, ran up to his colleague who had almost beaten the guy to death and asked him to stop it. The guard with the stubble alarmingly said that this kid was a long way from fulfilling the day's quota, and the second guard with bulging eyes and veins swollen with anger on his face tried to say something to counterbalance him. Their speeches were heard more muffled. The writer began to doubt that what was happening was a dream because everything was too real. The guard snorted boorishly in his direction and started to walk away. He turned briefly and said he was going to pick a day and beat him to a pulp. A battered young man with bruises and swelling on his face, reminiscent of his dead classmate, ran up to him and asked if he was okay. The young man himself was holding his shoulder, with all visible parts of his body covered in wounds. The guy addressed him as Kang Hu. The author couldn't believe what was happening for a second. Kang Hu. He thought there was no such thing, so he absent-mindedly looked at the dirty palms first, and then jumped up from his seat, nearly knocking down his friend who was already struggling to stand. He ran to the edge of the body of water, leaning against his reflection in the water. Suddenly his body began to be covered in the blue aura that was mana. A huge stream of mana started flowing into his body from all around him. At this moment, his friend ran up to him who didn't realize what was happening. The power to absorb mana at will. He glanced at his hand, his fingers continued to emit a blue light. He realized that this is definitely congenital mana hypersensitivity. He grabbed his head with one hand and leaned in front of the body of water with the other. The boy looked into his reflection and realized it was eerily familiar. He looked at his palm with horror and a brief panic attack. His pupils were constricted and cold sweat ran down his face. Did this really mean that he had found himself in Kang Hu's body? He sluggishly grabbed his forehead, after which he laughed nervously. Of all people, he was exactly in his body. He looked at his battered friend who was apologizing and saying that it was all because of him. The guy thought that if Kang Hu was still alive, it meant that the events were happening 5 years before the ending. He gloomily looked down and wondered that if he had inhabited Xie Chuan's body, he could at least be honored as a universal hero. He immediately visualized the pure and holy image of Xie Chuan with millions of hands reaching out to him. But in that case, this will end with the Demon King descending and only henchmen's lives will be saved. He visualized in his mind a huge hand reaching out from the heavenly black vortex, and hundreds of people who were afraid of being killed worshipped him. If he didn't change the ending, he would die a miserable death. He started to rise from his knees, after which he stood up proudly and confidently. After all, fortunately, he knows how to escape from this place. As expected, upon moving into his body, Kang Hu's experience and past became his. A blue crystal fell to the ground, tapping characteristically. Kang Hu stooped down to pick up the fallen stone. He stared emotionlessly into the void, and then a character information plate appeared, which read name, Kang Hu. Level 10. Class, Assassin. Constellation, None. Skill, Short Distance Leap LVL1, Traverse TELEPORTATION1 Latvian Lat. Although he's still on this level, as he held the blue crystal in his hand, he felt sick to his stomach, his body starting to feel woozy. His friend was working with the pickaxe, but then he looked at Kang Hu excitedly. The guy was sighing loudly, his whole face was sweaty from hard work and all his hands were blistered. He said his stamina was at 0. The author shouldn't have given him a weakness called congenital mana hypersensitivity just because he's a villain. As expected, this is the only way. Kang Hu began to draw something with a crystal on the ground, which further resembled a star. His friend excitedly ran up to him, calling him by name. As soon as Kang Hu heard him, he quickly erased the drawn star with his foot. His friend asked if he was okay, to which he calmly said that he was fine and he didn't have to worry. His friend ducked down to him and awkwardly asked if he should ask the wardens to give Kang Hu a little break. He grinned with a furrowed brow and said that if the wardens were the kind of people who gave a break depending on the condition of the worker, they wouldn't be stuck in a place like this. On the concrete wall hung a stone coat of arms with 3 swords carved into it, with stalactites sticking out from the top. The sickle and 3 swords were the symbol of this organization. He remembered how he had been grabbed by the 2 warders in Kang Hu's body and held in a grip that prevented him from moving. In this detention center, created by the criminal organization Eclipse, rookie hunters who can use mana are forced to work like a slave to mine mana stones. The workers in this place mined minerals day and night under the shouts of the warden, many of them falling down on the job. Kang Hu told his friend not to worry about him and went to mine the crystals. His friend suddenly looked away and asked him with a smile if he was planning to escape. Kang Hu rudely said to forget about it and go to work before he was caught for inactivity, for then he would be beaten up by the guards. He added that he shouldn't do anything rash, including that, to which his friend scratched the back of his head and smiled good-naturedly, agreeing with him. He went on to further mine the mana stones, as did Kang Hu, who was diligently working with a pickaxe. He did his best by warning him. This friend was a character he had invented to motivate Kang Hu. The memory of crossing paths with him in the school hallway came into his mind. The classmate was beaten up again. His face didn't have an area of skin without scratches, and his eye was swollen shut. Kang Hu swung the pickaxe to mine mana crystals time after time. The floor dripped off him in streams. The pickaxe clattered loudly on the stones. He couldn't make any changes to the novella now for the sake of a successful escape in the future. Work went on as usual at the mine. Everyone was busy doing something. It was quite dark there, with only a dim blue light coming from the mana stones. Most were busy transporting the mine stones on wooden wheelbarrows, including Kang Hu. Suddenly, someone's cry of pain was heard. Kang Hu was distracted for a second, immediately reacting to the noise. He looked at what was happening there. Some guy was crouching next to a guard, a worker had blood dripping from his head, and the warden was holding a long steel sword. At that moment, when the guard's attention was focused on the newbies, there's a crazy guy who tried to escape. He looked closer and realized it was his friend. The worker's forehead was pierced, and he seemed frozen in place, leaning on his hands. His face at that moment reflected true horror. The guard approached him closely and stood right in front of him. He ordered him to stare intently. At the sight of the huge sword, the guilty friend began to tremble, his eyes were ready to fill with tears, and he bit his lower lip. The warden raised the sword and pointed it toward the boy, telling him that he would take responsibility for doing crazy things. The guard cold-bloodedly stabbed the poor man through and through with his sword, instantly causing him terrible pain. The sword immediately turned scarlet because of the guy's blood. The weary and exhausted workers immediately forgot about everything. In front of their eyes, the sword stabbed through one of them without even flinching. The guard, with hatred in his eyes, continued to stab the prisoner with the sword, torturing him. The guy fell to the ground and raked the sand with his fingers, trying to endure this pain. The workers were disgusted by such cruelty, and many of them turned away with their eyes closed. Blood spatters flew all over the mine. Kang Hu bit his lip and trembled as he watched the brutal execution of his friend. His body was immobilized, he was deprived of life. The hand that was scraping the sand had stiffened and no longer moved. Kang Hu approached the bloody corpse that was once his friend. In his mind, he called him a fool, for he had asked him not to make rash actions. There was a huge gaping hole in the body left by the numerous sword blows. Kang Hu depressedly looked at the corpse without saying anything. At this moment, the overseer who had executed the poor man approached him from behind. He rudely asked Kang Hu why he didn't rage like last time and told him that since there was no one else around to stop Kang Hu, he would kill him too. His gaze was cruel and insane, and he had a sword with still warm blood on his shoulder. Kang-Hu sighed as he lowered his head and said that he absolutely did not care about his death. The guard became annoyed when he heard this because he thought that he would start begging for mercy. Kang-Hu indifferently told him that it was more important for him to let the guard go to the restroom right now. The guard was taken aback by this reaction that he even interrogated the guy. The guard sarcastically called him pathetic and asked him with a sneer if he had peed his pants. Kang-Hu stared at him silently until the guard turned away and gave him permission to go to the restroom with a sarcastic smirk. He ordered him to follow. Kang-Hu stared at him desolately as the workers slowly began to get to work, loading mana stones into boxes and carrying them out. He and the guard found themselves in a gray empty hallway. The warden said he was giving him 1 minute. Kang-Hu started to walk into the restroom when the guard angrily told him that if the guy stayed in there for more than a minute, this place would be his grave. Kang-Hu opened the door of the restroom and saw a horrible sight. The lights were off, the walls were cracked as well as the floor, and on the cold tiles lay the corpses of the employees who couldn't bear the strain and decided to commit suicide. Someone had a noose tied around his neck. Kang-Hu walked past that body. He was looking for something that should be somewhere in this place. He walked further by the corpses. At this time, the guard outside was counting out loud how much time Kang-Hu had left. The guy looked behind one of the dirty stalls, noticed a shard of tile sticking out on the floor, and ran his hand over it to make a cut. Blood immediately started to flow from the wound and he started to draw something on the floor. The guard kept counting at the same time. Kang-Hu had 39 seconds left. The guy tried to draw what he needed as fast as possible. It was a magic circle, inside of which was a 6-pointed star, similar to the one he drew while working. Between each end of the star were runic symbols. By this point, Kang-Hu had 13 seconds left. The magic circle he drew began to glow with a blue light, illuminating the gloomy restroom. He said he was sure it was following him, referring to the entity he was summoning. Kang-Hu stood back up and said he knew how the entity went crazy for tragedies, trials, and depression. The magic circle glowed brighter and brighter, and small white lightning bolts began to appear around it. The guard started banging on the door loudly and yelled that he had 10 seconds left, so it was time for him to finish his business and pull his pants back up. Kang-Hu turned around at the noise but didn't answer him anything. The magic circle at this time was releasing white pillars of light and blue sparks. Kang-Hu turned to the entity he was summoning and asked it if it was wondering how a low level like him was able to summon it. The constellation-shaped entity told him that if Kang-Hu had appeared a little later like it did in the novella, she would have appeared later. He would have fallen to the floor in shock, staring in amazement at her appearance accompanied by white lightning. And if he delayed even one more day, the hope the whole world was looking for would be too far away to reach. Constellation said that was exactly how he would tell him everything, to convince her to answer his call, since he had become the entertainment Kang-Hu had been seeking for so long. He gazed excitedly at the appearance of the magical aura from the circle, before placing his hands on his hips and saying that he was the only person who would use his abilities to the best of his ability. Lightning bolts began to pass through Kang-Hu, and his smile became insane. A wind blew from the magic circle, which developed Kang-Hu's hair and his uniform. He knew that it would appear, the main constellation who made a contract with Kang-Hu in the novel. He visualized what he looked like at the time of the last chapter in his black suit and knives. The name of this constellation was Dimension Looter. Kang-Hu watched the eruption of magic from the circle. Even though the constellation called it brazen, it let him use its power for a while since Kang-Hu had caught its attention. A bright, almost blinding star lit up. The Dimension Looter ordered to manifest for him. Kang-Hu smugly looked at him and said, "Sit back and watch." White energy swirled around near him. A system window appeared with a description of the constellation, Dimension Looter. A neutral constellation. A constellation that has specialized skills looting and increasing proficiency. All skills have been maximized. Find one to make your own. The guard banged his fist loudly on the door again, stepping into the threshold of the restroom. He rudely asked who Kang-Hu thought he was, then started to enter the restroom. The inside was empty, all the corpses of the workers had disappeared somewhere, and there was a mysterious haze coming from Kang-Hu's side. The guard incomprehensibly started walking further until he noticed Kang-Hu's silhouette in the haze. The guard tensed up, but then he went into a stupor and sweat as he saw what was about to happen. A system window appeared. First, all skills will maintain maximum proficiency. The short distance leap level increased from 1 to maximum. Kang-Hu was surrounded by a blue aura, and his eyes were glowing blue. He jumped towards the guard who was holding a sword in his hand. Traverse teleportation was improved from level 1 to maximum. Kang-Hu disappeared a second later from the sight of the dumbfounded guard who was already ready to beat the guy up. The guard gritted his teeth and turned around, expecting to see Kang-Hu behind him, but there was only the entrance to the restroom, with a sink and mirror next to it. He was looking at the door when suddenly, out of nowhere, Kang-Hu was at his back in cold blood. He had a sharp metal pin in his hands, which he plunged straight into the aggressive warden's neck. Blood spurted out of his mouth through his teeth. The guard gritted his teeth and covered one eye because of the unbearable pain. He tried to turn towards Kang Hu, but he only pushed the pin in deeper. The guard started shaking and trembling. He didn't understand how Kang Hu managed to do it. The guy abruptly pulled the pin out of the man's neck. Blood flowed from there. He tried desperately to cover the wound by throwing the sword on the floor, but it was too deep, so he fell dead on the tiled floor. Kang Hu held the bloody pin firmly in his right hand and wryly thanked the warden. After all, he was the reason why Kang Hu dared to leave this place today. He wiped the blood from his face that had gotten on it during the killing. He took another look at the breathless body of the guard, feeling nothing but true hatred towards him. Dimension Looter said that Kang Hu is very interesting and the contract is complete. Kang Hu exhaled with his head down. Thus he avenged his executed friend. He ducked down to take the long and sharp sword for himself. Kang Hu put the sword into the scabbard. A system window appeared. A weapon has been registered. He promised himself not to look back from now on. Outside the window, it was deep night. It was a full moon, and the stars shone brightly in the night sky. Not even the clouds interfered with them. The warden's corpse and Kang Hu's silhouette were illuminated by the dim white moonlight. Kang Hu found a tank of gasoline somewhere and spilled it on the corners of the building. He spared no expense and sprayed it everywhere he could. The first step to escape was to get a second-rank warden's uniform. He took the clothes off the dead guard and put them on himself. The shirt collar even had traces of blood from the neck puncture. The second step to escape was arson. He found a lighter and flicked it on. His pupils narrowed, but his face was generally indifferent, just a twinge of hatred in his eyes. He carelessly threw the lighter into the puddle of gasoline, starting to set the whole place on fire. Everything instantly began to go up in flames. The third and final step was to escape through the main gate. The entire building was ablaze with violent fire, forming a chain reaction. Kang Hu started to go outside from there. The fire was noticed by the rest of the staff, and it began to spread to neighboring buildings. The wardens started to run out of the institution one by one in panic. Some didn't even realize how the fire started, and another guard said that the fire started in front of building number 18. The wide-faced warden in a panic asked loudly who did it, and the second guard with a goofy face ordered to call the fire department first. The loud stomping of the guards' heavy boots was heard as they headed for the squad cars. One of them entered the car through the back door and shouted to everyone to follow instructions. He also said they had to go to the crematorium first. The doors of the armored cars began to close with a rumbling noise. Two guards sat in the front seat. One was very young and the other was a little older than him. The older officer ordered them to hurry up, to which the younger one said he understood him. He was the one driving. He looked suspiciously in the rearview mirror and asked Kang Hu about his second-rank uniform. Kang Hu sat silently at this time, slightly lowering his gaze. The car was a military vehicle, so it was quite spacious inside. The floor was covered with metal plates, and there were benches on the sides at the back for passengers. The junior officer asked Kang Hu again if he had been sent to replace the second-rank supervisor who was in charge of them. Kang Hu calmly answered him without any change in his face that yes, and added that someone had just escaped from building number 18. The driver was genuinely surprised and turned around, trying to find out the details. Kang Hu told him that the intruder had run out through the fence on the northwest side of that building. He turned to the young driver and asked why they were still standing still. The man immediately came to his senses and apologized, saying they were leaving right away. The car abruptly took off and drove forward. Kang Hu drove silently with them, thinking about how he had lied to the staff. The path northwest of the fence leads to Mount Chungmyeong. At first glance it seems like a good escape route since it is unlit, unguarded and difficult. There is an entrance among the dense trees in the forest at the foot of the mountain, but this path is actually crawling with traps that have been set by Eclipse, making this road the most dangerous route. The trap contained the corpses of prisoners who tried to make an escape through this road. Kang Hu planned to use this information, which was only known to the guards, and escape. The first gate began to open, letting cars in and out of the detention center. Kang Hu sat with his legs spread wide and rested his hands on them, which he placed under his chin. He said that they should try to catch the intruder on his escape route, but even if they lost sight of him, he would be heading towards Mount Chungmyeong, so they should just bring the corpse back. The young driver watched the road carefully and answered him that he understood. The guard at the exit gate shouted H warning, and from the armored car, cigarettes were shouted back to him. Perhaps they were the secret codes of the staff. The guard started waving his arms from top to bottom, then shouted that it was clear, giving permission for the car that Kang Hu was in to leave. He looked at the departing establishment with hatred and was happy to finally leave this nightmarish place. The stone pedestal also had their emblem carved on it, 3 swords. The car was traveling fast on a small road that only had 2 lanes. They were passing along a forest with dense trees. The young transportation driver told Kang Hu that he was probably tired considering what was happening in building number 18. Kang Hu only now noticed that the collar of his uniform, which he had stolen, was covered in blood. He he tisked irritably, then told the driver that it was easier to kill the mine workers because those prisoners just wouldn't listen to them. The driver of the car smiled cheekily and agreed with him, saying that these people were hunters in name only, they were total losers, really. The second employee who sat in the navigator's seat was surprised by his words, but outwardly didn't show it. He asked himself, looking stealthily at Kang-Hu, if the driver had really called the prisoners like that. The navigator turned to the Kang-Hu sitting behind him and asked how long he had been on duty in building number 18. He definitely didn't trust him, however he tried not to give it away. Kang-Hu smelled something wrong and tried to dismiss his suspicions. He exhaled and said with an annoyed face that he had come the day before yesterday. The navigator told him that in that case, he was working in Block 9. Kang-Hu had no choice but to confirm it. That's where the staff member caught him. He looked at him suspiciously, translating the gaze of his brown eyes. He said that Unit 9 didn't exist, it must have been created the day before yesterday. Chuckling wryly, Kang-Hu couldn't believe it. He listened to him with a grimace of horror and hatred on his face. They were already driving off-road deep in the quiet forest. The asphalt had run out a few kilometers ago. Kang-Hu then gave a sly smirk and replied that that was the case. He said that he was only created to take out people like them. Kang-Hu grabbed the hilt of his sword and pulled it out of its sheath lightning fast, chopping off the head of the employee who first noticed something wrong. His head flew in the air and then fell to the floor of the car. The driver looked shocked at the decapitated body of his coworker, and at the same time, Kang-Hu swung a second time, preparing to kill the remaining passenger. His face looked cold-blooded again, and his hair was disheveled. On his chin, he still had a small scar on the right side after a scuffle while mining monastones. The driver lost control for a while, so the car began to skid from side to side. Kang-Hu managed to grab the front seats with both hands, so he was able to stay alive when an unbelted passenger flew through the windshield due to the sudden stop of the vehicle. Shards of glass hit the interior of the vehicle and the bloody body flew 3 meters forward. The car left behind it dirty and soiled traces on the ground, dust rose around it. It was pitch darkness on the road, and only the car headlights illuminated the broken glass and the body in a pool of its own blood. The young driver was furious. He turned to Kang-Hu with a crazed look and began to concentrate energy in his left hand. The energy resembled a bright yellow sphere. Kang-Hu noticed it, so he reacted in time and was able to dodge the attack. His attack hit the roof of the cabin, and there was a small explosion. Kang-Hu, without moving from his seat, furtively raised his gaze and looked. The roof of the car was burned through. At the edges of the hole that had formed, the metal was still billowing. The ash from the explosion instantly rose into the air. The driver did not expect Kang-Hu to be able to dodge. He froze in the same position he was in at the time of the attack. Kang-Hu stood at a distance and watched his further actions. The driver became even more furious and shouted at Kang-Hu how dare he deceive them. He started charging the attack again. It was going to be even bigger and even stronger. This time the attack was aimed directly at Kang-Hu. It lightning fast went through the roof of the car, spreading dozens of meters upwards, illuminating the entire surroundings with a bright yellow light. There was almost no whole space left on the roof, the metal edges smoldering and smoking, producing a vile smell of burning. The driver smiled smugly and looked back, saying how useless Kang-Hu was. The guy clenched his left hand into a fist as if rejoicing in his victory. However, after a second, he looked around the salon and realized that there was no Kang-Hu in it, no body of his. The salon was just empty. He looked in the left side mirror and saw the guy sitting on one knee outside, and a second later, only the dust and haze from Kang-Hu's teleportation was left in that spot. He moved into the interior of the car, immediately preparing for a counterattack. Kang-Hu put his sword forward, and a moment later, the driver of the car was already stabbed through at the neck area. Kang-Hu's face was as unperturbed as ever at times like this. The driver coughed and began to choke as blood splashes flew onto the dashboard. The other end of the sharp sword pierced through the tempered glass. Blood began to flow from the driver's mouth and his body began to shake violently. He couldn't even take a breath because of the blade in his throat. Kang-Hu cruelly and mercilessly pulled out the bloody sword from the driver's neck. His blood started to stream from there. He roughly pushed the dying employee out of the car outside, but then he suddenly felt a sharp weakness and a throbbing headache. His face twisted slightly from the sudden pain, and he bit his lower lip. He crouched down and grabbed his left head in pain, cursing. He assumed he had used too much mana. He heard sirens blaring, glanced anxiously at his side mirror and saw a patrol car approaching in it, blinding him with its yellow headlights. He clutched his head desperately, maintaining a frantic smile. He hadn't expected them to be on patrol. He told himself that this would be the last hurdle. He quickly jumped out of the car through the open window and stealthily started down the slope beside the road. He rolled and picked up speed. Kang-Hu planted his right foot to control the speed and direction of his movements. He bent his left leg slightly so that he could push down with it and stop in case of anything. He also kept himself off balance with his right. He finished his descent down the sharp rocky slope, landing neatly on both feet and his left arm. He rested his hand on his right knee and exhaled tiredly. Someone turned to him and told him that it had been an accident. He can't believe Kang Hu managed to kill 2 wardens and escape. Kang Hu anxiously raised his head and tried to see the young man who had spoken. The stranger started to walk closer to Kang Hu. He was a tall, muscular guy. He was wearing a black t-shirt, blue jeans, leather jacket and gloves. His hair was dark and he was holding a modern axe. He called him low-ranking trash. Kang Hu noticed that the guy had a red mark above his head and he was surrounded by a scarlet aura. This hunter is in a contract on Constellation. Kang Hu wonders what his power is. He looked at the approaching figure incredulously, a drop of sweat running down his face. A system window appeared above the stranger's head. Skillful connector. Neutral leaning constellation. A constellation with the ability to track mana. He looked at Kang Hu with a cheeky look of interest, one eyebrow raised upwards and a smirk on his lips. Kang Hu placed one hand on the ground, releasing an aura of blue mana. The ability to track mana. So that's how he found Kang Hu so easily. The hero grinned and smirked contentedly, saying this turned out great. The stranger asked rudely and incomprehensibly what he meant. Kang Hu carefully looked at the constellation this guy's in a contract with and the red mark above his head for a reason. Kang Hu once again looked at the system window with a smirk and excitement at the constellation information of the stranger. A new system window appeared. Third, by killing another hunter, you are able to loot them of their contracted constellation. The stranger continued to smile cheekily and stare at Kang Hu while he looked at the red mark above his head. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of Kang Hu's face. You are able to loot this target. He grinned enthusiastically. After all, this is a chance to use constellation loot for the first time. They were facing each other at a distance of 3 meters. Around them was nothing but rock, grass, piles of stones, and loose earth. But if he's made a contract with a constellation, he's probably at least level 100. Kang Hu needs to avoid a head-to-head fight. Kang Hu instantly jumped out of his seat, running away to the side. So he wants to draw him in and attack instead. The stranger rolled his eyes and said with a sneer that he was really low-ranking trash. He put his palm above his head for a better view. He continued to smirk, telling Kang Hu to try his best to hide. The guy's eyes began to glow blue, turning into an infrared camera. Only instead of measuring temperature, he was measuring the concentration of mana in the surroundings. Before his eyes, the world was colored in shades of blue, and the outlines of trees were outlined in green. He walked along the forest path, occasionally turning his head for a better view. He looked over every scrap of land, every tree. He chuckled and wondered where he was hiding when suddenly he saw a red trail to his right. His eyes filled even more with blue light. He reacted instantly. One of the trees in the trunk changed color from blue to yellow and red. His ability gave off a mana concentration warning. He gave a sly smirk, saying that he had found it. He threw several hand axes powerfully, running closer to the tree, leaves and grass flying to the sides. He cut the tree in half, leaving only a thin stump. The stranger was puzzled when he realized that there was no one behind the tree. He irritably called Kang Hu a rat and asked where he had gone. A moment later, he froze in a mute scream as his throat was pierced by a sharp sword blade. He couldn't make a single sound, only a muffled wheeze. Kang Hu kneeled in front of him, holding the hilt of his sword with both hands. The guy started to try to cough, but he couldn't. Blood oozed from his throat, dripping onto the forest path. Kang Hu grinned at him, saying how stupid it was. A proximity dealer would just throw his weapon away. Scarlet blood flowed down the blade of the sword, reaching its hilt. The stranger's eyes were becoming glassy. Kang Hu said that it was his own fault. He shouldn't have looked down at his opponent. His face was indifferent. He mercilessly twitched the knife to the side, leaving the guy no chance of life. Crimson streams began to flow from his neck. The hunter's body fell breathlessly on his back. The stranger's last memory would be the cold-blooded face of Kang Hu. A system window appeared. You have killed the target and seized his contract with skillful connector. Kang Hu looked calm, though he was breathing tiredly while he was reading the next system window carefully. Skillful connector is under the control of Dimension Looter and is unable to escape outside of extinction or termination of the contract. There were 3 system windows in front of him now. One of them was character information, and the remaining 2 were about his abilities. A new system window appeared and announced, all of Skillful Connector's abilities have been transferred to you. Kang Hu thoughtfully looked at the information about him while wiping the blood from his face with his hand. He scrolled down to the ability section below, where 2 abilities appeared, both of which were at the maximum level, Mana Tracking Ability and Night Vision. He continued to flip through the rest of his information. Kang Hu was pleased with himself and the fact that he had managed to get the stranger's contract. He decided to check the mana tracking himself, his pupils and iris filled with blue light. He looked around. All objects were displayed in blue with a green outline. There were no red or yellow signals, so there are no more pursuers nearby. Suddenly, Kang Hu felt a sudden loss of strength and nausea. He covered his mouth with the palm of his hand in case he felt that he was about to vomit, but he realized that it was useless to hold back his vomiting. He He rested his sword on the ground and crouched down, coughing and panting. He began to vomit blood clots. Perhaps he had exerted himself too much and his body couldn't take it. He tried to catch his breath. He was dizzy. He was almost faint. Kang Hu looked at his palm, which had bloodstains on it. His face began to pale. To hide his marks from the enemy, he suppressed his mana hypersensitivity, hiding behind a tree. When the pursuer passed by, Kang Hu found a very ordinary cobblestone and poured all his mana into it, causing thick veins to appear on the guy's hand at that moment. The stone began to turn blue, glowing, and if you left it as it was, the explosion would suck out all the surrounding mana like near a mine reservoir. So he had to immediately suppress his mana hypersensitivity state and throw the rock away. He then strained hard so that the ability wouldn't work. Sweat even ran down his face, and the rock flew and stuck into the tree that the stranger had chopped with his axes. Thanks to this, he successfully lured the enemy out and was able to kill him, but in order to quickly approach him, Kang Hu had to use short-distance leap, which helped him move around. But due to the lack of mana, the ability caused Kang Hu's body to be in such a pitiful state of exhaustion. His head felt as if it was splitting. A violent migraine came over him in a wave. He tried to restrain himself from screaming by biting his lower lip. If he pushes himself anymore, he'd just straight up die here. The sun was already starting to rise. Kang Hu needed to find a secluded and safe place. He slowly walked on the cold ground, trying not to faint. Kang Hu passaged near a cliff that had a highway next to it. He turned his attention to it and looked down tiredly. A truck was passing by, carrying sand meant for cleaning main stones. Kang Hu scattered as far as his condition allowed him and jumped off the cliff, trying to land directly into the back of the truck. He managed to jump to it by standing on the sand with his feet. He looked up at the morning sky. The clouds were colored in warm shades of orange, and the sky above was already blue. He tiredly laid down with his back on the sand, running his hand through his disheveled and messy hair. Kang Hu had killed 3 guards during his escape. This was not in the novel. He moved, leaning his back against the wall of the truck. He needs to make sure that the future doesn't change while he's still getting stronger so that he can use what he knows. He figured that, given his insignificant position in this world, the future shouldn't change somehow. He had bags under his eyes from lack of sleep and rest, and his face was indifferent on one side and miserable on the other. The truck passed near forests, mountains, and the sea. Kang Hu smiled relaxedly for the first time in a long time as he looked at the seascape. The morning seascape was incredibly beautiful and calm. The dawn sky, colored in shades of pink and orange, is reflected on the water surface. The morning seascape is full of mysticism and inspiration. Just one look at it makes you forget your worries and immerse yourself in the world of silence and beauty. A building showed up. Perhaps it belonged to the government or other high-ranking services. The man with a cigarette in his teeth was talking about how they could just find new low-ranking rookies to mine mana stones so they had nothing to worry about. He ordered someone to get back to work. The subordinate took his order and walked out the door, closing it. The man with the cigarette was dressed in a strict suit and a dark coat. He had a small beard and short sideburns. He was looking thoughtfully out the window. The man smirked and said that Kang Hu was a pretty smart kid. To think he'd catch us off guard and confidently leave through the front gate. At this time, Kang Hu himself was walking into a blue phone booth, and across from him was an overturned white car in the crosswalk. He was breathing heavily and struggling to hold onto the walls of the booth to keep from falling. Because of excessive usage of mana, his stamina isn't recovering easily. He began to dial a number with bloody and dirty fingers. Meanwhile, the high-ranking man continued to think about Kang Hu. So a level 10 assassin class whose residents can't even be found killed a level 45 and a level 55 with a constellation. Kang Hu's top secret file was on his desk. Kang Hu reached someone at that time. He said hello and introduced himself. The girl on the other end of the line answered, calling him by name. Kang Hu said he was across the street from Dijin Station. He asked if his conversation partner could do him a favor. The man with the cigarette at this time laughed and said that this will be a fun hunt. At this time, Kang Hu was visiting his friend Seo Yeon. Her room had light-colored wallpaper and had various shelves of books. Kang Hu thanked Seo Yeon for treating him when he asked her out of the blue. The girl carefully bandaged Kang Hu's body with bandages and asked what happened to him and if he was in a war zone. Kang Hu said that the eclipse had kidnapped him. The girl was dumbfounded as she pressed her lips together, and after a moment, she asked Kang Hu if he had been pulled into a mine of mana stones. She noted that the organization was known for kidnapping hunters. Hing was an incredibly beautiful yet strong girl. She had short gray hair and her eyes were a light blue. She had a strong build and broad shoulders, her entire body covered in old scars. She was wearing a gray t-shirt and short blue shorts. Kang Hu had told her that the workers themselves needed mana to mine mana stones, so low-level hunters like Kang Hu would quickly become prey to the other hunters. Kang Hu's gaze became serious and cold. Even though he could fall prey to the hunters, he could trust Seo Yeon and contacted her because she still loves Kang-hoo. Seo Yeon grabbed her head and started sobbing while whispering apologies to Kang-hoo. The girl's face was covered in a blush and she herself couldn't hold back her tears. She said that if she had kept in touch with Kang-hoo after what had happened between them, he wouldn't have had to go through all that horror. At the time of their breakup, she was a newbie hunter who had recently awakened. Though right now, she's a level 150 veteran in a contract with the Constellation. Kang-hoo looked at the girl who was crying bitterly and saw a red mark above her head, indicating a constellation. If she had been with him back then, she would have been dragged to the Chungyang detention center as well. Kang-hoo tiredly closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead in exhaustion. The bandaged Kang-hoo started to get up from the floor, telling the girl that that's enough caring from her and nothing good will come out of getting involved with him. How? The clips might even track her. Seo Yeon tried to change his mind and keep the guy for a little longer. She said that she was now at level 150, a level where ordinary hunters could no longer treat her so carelessly. Kang-hoo coldly said that she didn't need to worry about him so much. He smiled and said that she should only use this power for herself. Seo Yeon remained silent at these words. Kang-hoo was about to leave Seo Yeon's apartment. She prepared a set of freshly washed clothes for him and told him that she had put him enough money and a formatted smartphone. It wasn't supposed to be traceable. Kang-hoo told her that it looks like her guild is dipping its toes in a somewhat gray border. That's right. Back then and even now a guild suits her. He remembered the moment they had broken up, when Seo Yeon looked much smaller and had long hair, while Kang-hoo's appearance hadn't changed since then. Seo Yeon embarrassedly folded her palms on her chest and asked if Kang-hoo wanted to join her guild. She said very softly that they could be together again like they once were in the past. Kang-hoo interrupted her by calling her by name. He looked at her detachedly and coldly, even though he was grateful for her help. He softened a little and told her not to stay trapped in the past. He pulled his hand back, asking her to gesture for it to stop. Seo Yeon's large blue eyes began to fill with tears and her lips twitched. She lowered her head, her face flushed again, and a tear ran down her cheek. She smiled slightly and then agreed with him. The tears continued to roll down her face. Kang-hoo was about to leave as Seo Yeon told him that she took care of his request. She has a friend who is a leader. She left all the details in her phone. She looked at him responsively and sensually and told him to take care of himself and wished him to stay healthy. Kang-hoo peacefully thanked her and told her to take care of herself too. He left the apartment and went downstairs. A gray cab was already waiting for him there. It was warm and sunny outside. Kang-hoo asked the driver to take him to Dijin Station. The mustachioed, middle-aged cab driver said he wanted to turn on the radio and asked if Kang-hoo minded. He stared blankly out the window and said he didn't mind. The cab driver turned up the volume and the news was on the radio. News has it that the Youngwa Guild has assassinated the entire White Rose Mercenary Corps. After Judgment Day, the White Rose Corps based in Gyeongsan, Gangwon-do is a rapidly rising criminal organization. Kang-hoo had knowledge of Judgment Day. That day came quietly and unnoticed. All the streets were empty, and the previously vibrant neighborhoods looked abandoned. On a sunny day, a car was driving on a wide road, but there were no other cars. There was an ominous atmosphere in the air. The driver of this car, a young guy, said that today was a bit strange because it was a day off and there was not a single car on the street. He turned to his wife, but she didn't answer him. Her face was corroded to the skull, and the remaining skin on her neck was already beginning to vaporize. All that remained of his wife was a skeleton, and his face contorted in a grimace of horror and despair. The Dark Reaper appeared in front of him, already pointing his scythe at the guy's neck. He let out a piercing scream of fear and pain. More and more Dark Reapers swooped down on their car. A reporter was broadcasting from the scene of action. She was standing on the roof of a building in Seoul's Gangnam neighborhood. She was reporting that the sky was colored a dark purple hue and it could be seen even from a long distance. Hence the early reports that there were monsters in the area. She didn't have time to finish the last sentence because something with green scales that resembled a dragon grabbed her and ate her. The green monster began to slide down the wall closer to the streets, where other monsters resembling spiders and wolves were devouring the citizens. Monsters of unknown identity. Dungeons covered with strange skies. In the middle of this mayhem, the ones who acquired powers are now called hunters. People tried to hide in fear on the roofs of high-rise buildings, but the monsters could get there too. The only ones who could help them were hunters, who killed monsters and beasts. This inexplicable situation led people to believe divine judgment had fallen. The city was in shambles, buildings and cars were on fire, and the roads were littered with abandoned cars of citizens trying to escape the nightmare. The hunters who originally hunted monsters began to hunt people. Many people could be seen chopping monsters to pieces with their swords. Among them were dragons, giant snakes, and werewolves. At first, the hunters killed people in the name of the gods, but later they started to do it for no reason. The demented guy stood with a ghastly smile while the bodies of a dozen innocent citizens lay behind him. A girl whose face was all abrasions and whose clothes were stained was running away from someone. She stopped when she realized there was nowhere else to run. She was breathing heavily, trying to regain her breathing rhythm. She stood fearfully near the wall as a crowd of unscrupulous hunters approached her. One of them said someone thought he was harassing her. He came closer to her with sword in hand and told her not to worry, for after one blow it would be over painlessly. He swung the sword, but at that moment someone stopped the blade with his white-gloved palm. It was covered in blood, but the savior asked the girl if she was okay. As the story nears its end, the savior of the world Xiachuan appears. He was the one who had stopped the hunters who were about to harm the girl. The hem of his robe glistened, and he looked like a saint who had come down from heaven. Centered in Seoul, he created the helper, the protector, and the healer of the people, the Yunghwa Guild. A light and warm energy emanated from his hand, as if it was trying to heal and protect the girl. Xiachuan smiled blissfully as he looked serenely at her. This is why everyone is eager to get to such a supposedly safe Seoul. Kang Hu continued to ride in the cab and stared blankly out the window. The radio said that the White Rose Corps had been long tracked down by Hunter Xiachuan for plotting a terror attack at exit 11 of Gangnam Station in Seoul. The bags under Kang Hu's eyes were very bright and a faint smile appeared on his face. At this time, his cab driver was happily surprised that an entire terrorist organization had been eliminated, and then he exclaimed that he didn't expect anything else from Xiachuan. The driver looked at Shin through his rearview mirror, keeping a parallel eye on the road. The White Rose Corps were not a terrorist organization, according to Kang Hu. Of course, they didn't stage terrorist attacks among other things. It was all planned by Xiachuan. The cab driver asked Xiachuan if him being a Korean hunter was a matter of great pride. Kang Hu took out his smartphone and started looking at something on it, and the cab driver went on to tell him that his son had recently awakened his powers too, and his dream was to join Xiachuan's guild. Kang Hu realized that if he went against Xiachuan by telling the whole truth about him, he would turn Kang Hu into a villain in the eyes of the people, and the outcome of that is clear as day. Kang Hu remembered the crowd asking to finish him off in the novella. He imagined them standing back to back with Xiachuan, but only Xiachuan was illuminated by a bright light and Kang Hu was in his shadow. He was reading something on his smartphone as he passed by the skyscrapers. He asked Seo Yeon for a favor to be introduced to the mercenary squad because the other guilds might be within his reach. The driver said that they had arrived. Outside the window were high-rise apartment complexes, offices, and highways. Kang Hu was a bit worried. However, being a mercenary who gets a job exclusively from the mercenary squad was the best option for him. A girl in gray clothes extended her hand to him and said hello. She said she heard about No from Seo Yeon. She introduced herself. Her name was Yi-Rin. She was a tall and slender girl with long brown hair. Yi-Rin was wearing an open-shouldered top and leather pants, and on her feet she had high-heeled boots. In her hands, she was holding a folder of documents. Kang Hu didn't need to introduce himself by his real name, so he called himself Sun Kaiyu and extended his hand to the girl in return. They shook hands and Yi-Rin said it was nice to meet you. She started rummaging through a folder looking for the right paper, saying that she had a great job as a collector for him. Kang Hu said seriously, he's not suited for such a thing. He needs a job with good pay and she can give him challenging tasks first. Yi-Rin stopped digging through the folder and said puzzled that she definitely heard that the guy is only at level 10. He calmly confirmed this information and the girl started giggling quietly in response, but soon she couldn't stand it anymore and started laughing loudly without even being embarrassed. She even had a tear spill out from laughing, which she wiped away with the words that Kang Hu is just ridiculous. They say that being too bold is reckless bragging. She became serious and detached in the same second. Yi-Rin's body and face became covered in a green aura and she asked if he wanted her to clean up after him afterward with the remnants of his dead body. Kang Hu smiled excitedly and asked if having skills was the most important thing in mercenary work despite the level of the person. It seemed strange for Kang Hu to meet the character he had carefully and painstakingly created. A red constellation mark appeared above her head and a system window appeared next to it, Observer of Chaos. Neutral leaning constellation. A constellation with the ability to distort and block sight. Yi-Rin was a mage and protector who had a contract with an above-average constellation. She was created by him to oppose the 13 stars in Xiachuan. He visualized in his mind the majestic image of Xiachuan surrounded by bright red stars, and in front of him stood Lai surrounded by a bright green aura. Kang Hu realized that he had to gain her trust first. He tried to gather his thoughts. His face seemed calm but also a little worried. Yi-Rin continued to emit a dark green aura as the guy told her that only abilities and skills were needed, regardless of your level. He asked her if she was a mercenary herself. Yi-Rin tiredly exhaled, covered her eyes and respectfully said that reality and spirit are different things. She lowered her head, realizing that he was saying the right things, but she couldn't be completely sure of him. Kang Hu walked past Lai, who stood with an emotionless expression, and replied that prejudice and truth are also different things. She smiled faintly and hummed. Yi-Rin turned to him and smiled mischievously, putting on the glasses she had previously had on like a headband. She agreed and said that he should show her the skills then. They stood opposite each other at a distance of 10 meters near a glass building. Yu-Rin began to concentrate the energy sphere of green energy in her right hand and said that she would judge exactly one thing: whether he could dodge her attack. Green light covered her body and a green haze began to ooze out from the sphere. She was smiling slightly evilly, but she wasn't going to seriously harm the guy. Kang, who stood relaxed, he too was affected by her green light. He said that she wanted to see if he could at least protect his body. Yu-Rin replied in the affirmative and said that the evasion skill can create the possibility of a retaliatory attack. Kang, who got into a fighting stance, preparing to attack. He covered his face with his hand because the light was too bright. He realized that that's creating puppets using fog and being able to track even in faraway places. Fog trackers. A fantastic and mystical elven woman appeared out of the green haze and fog. Kang, who started to look at her and thought that it's not an attack skill, so he won't die even if he gets hit, but if he can't dodge, traces will remain, so the test will end immediately. Kang, who shouted loudly that it's time to start, putting her fist to her chest, to which Yu-Rin excitedly replied that she was starting. The first green elf puppet flew towards Kang, who, followed by a soft green trail. The puppet was moving extremely fast. However, Kang, who himself was in no hurry to move. He was ready to dodge at any second, but he was waiting for the right moment. Kang, who saw that they were only centimeters away from colliding, and then his silhouette was illuminated by a green haze and a translucent glow. Yu-Rin stood there in incomprehension as to what had just happened. However, she turned around and shockedly looked at Kang, who was vigorously running along the glass wall of the multi-story building. She watched in amazement as he slid down the glass. She thought that this makes no sense. At this level, even jumping a meter would be hard. He's proficient in using the assassin's basic skill short distance leap. Yu-Rin couldn't believe that a level 10 hunter could use his skills so proficiently. She smirked a little wickedly. After all, he wasn't just idly bragging. She released a second puppet that flew straight towards the wall towards Kang, who. She wondered with excitement if he would be able to dodge this time as well. The green puppet flew lightning fast, leaving behind a small shockwave. Yu-Rin's hair began to develop in the wind. She controlled the flight trajectory of the puppet, which flew right within an inch of the glass walls. She noticed that Kang, who changed the trajectory of running along the wall, so the puppet followed right behind him. Kang, who anxiously turned around, after which he smirked contentedly. He saw that the puppet was about to fly over and touch Kang, who, but he managed to teleport back a couple of centimeters, thus avoiding the collision. The puppet vaporized, releasing a huge amount of green energy. Yu-Rin watched all of this from the ground, not realizing how he was doing it. She turned away slightly so that she wouldn't get hit much by the shockwave, but it still disturbed her, causing Yu-Rin to growl softly. She looked up again with an astonished expression. Kang, who ducked again. Her gray eyes were opened in surprise, and her thick black lashes rose up. She wondered what not to mention, just earlier, that traversed teleportation. While Yu-Rin was trying to see the guy in her green haze, Kang, who had already teleported behind her back and drew his sword. He coldly leaned the blade against her neck. Yu-Rin worriedly shifted her gaze to him. Kang, who calmly suggested to end the test at this point. Yu-Rin looked at him a bit fearfully, but realized that no harm would come to him. She hummed and stepped aside. Kang, who thought that she was faster than he expected, so she was a mercenary commander for a reason. He frowned slightly and a drop of sweat ran down his face. Yu-Rin tried to make a calm face, but she couldn't help but be intimidated by the fact that a rookie could move like that. She asked if Kang, who had practiced before. He continued to hold the blade at her neck and replied that he hadn't practiced before. Yu-Rin moved the blade away from her face with 2 fingers, smiling widely. She said that these movements were not something that a level 10 assassin could repeat. Kang, who asked a little anxiously if he passed the test, to which Yu-Rin smiled and replied that he had passed and she could give him tasks that were meant for level 50 people. Kang, who started to put his sword away in his scabbard, he said that it was good. He was looking somewhere in the distance. The sky was bright blue, although it was a bit cloudy. Yu-Rin and Kang, who were driving together in a minivan through a neighborhood that looked destroyed. She was driving in the front seat, and the guy was sitting in the back looking out the window thoughtfully. Yu-Rin looked at him through the rearview mirror and grinned. She happily asked him if Kang, who was interested in bulletproof glass. She said there was a shooter recently who gave her some trouble. Kang, who expressionlessly asked to clarify which shooter she was talking about. Yu-Rin laughed good-naturedly while holding her face with one hand. She said that she had recently received a lot of attention and love from the Eclipse people. Kang, who looked at her tiredly and irritatedly and thought that there was a turf war between them. She summoned her green elf girl to get a roll of paper. Yu-Rin said it was in order to track a wanted criminal. The elfess handed the piece of paper to Kang, who, a little embarrassed, then Yu-Rin added that she herself was the customer and this order would be quite useful to him. He read what was in the contents of the order. Gyeonggi-do Province, Asan City. Open dungeon abandoned ruins. Mukhyun, level 50, mage. Request to retrieve 3rd rank item Vartaros' shoes. It was a semi-abandoned town and the target was a marginal-looking man who looked like a homeless man. Kang-hoo read it carefully, paying attention to every word. There was a little pixie hovering on a piece of paper, watching Kang-hoo. The guy asked if he should be taken out alive. Yi-rin smiled good-naturedly, saying that he might as well kill him. Mukhyun has killed too many civilians. He can execute him on spot, and the Hunter National Security will like it too. Kang-hoo grinned and exclaimed that he was ready to execute him right now. He arrived in Asan. The city was dusty and dilapidated. The buildings looked like they could collapse right now. He walked along the deserted road all alone. Yi-rin had told him a few hours ago that Mukhyun was most likely hiding somewhere in the corners, so finding him would not be an easy task as the place was not small. Kang-hoo walked past empty houses with broken windows, buildings with collapsed roofs and toppled signs. This was not a bad starting dungeon for Kang-hoo. This place had been used as a hideout for Kang-hoo in the novella, so he was quite familiar with it. Also, there were some pretty useful medium difficulty bosses here. He walked through the empty streets with confidence, looking straight ahead of him at the stretching roads. Kang-hoo had changed his weapon. It was now more like Kang-hoo's weapon in the novella. It was a huge knife. Behind the ruins sat white rabbits with red eyes. Kang-hoo noticed them, glanced in their direction and said that he had finally found them. Kang-hoo slashed his palm with the knife. Blood started to flow from there. The rabbits paid attention to him. The flowing blood had a special effect on these rabbits, making them aggressive and bloodthirsty. They started screaming with their thin voices, showing their fangs and releasing their giant claws. They instantly rushed towards Kang-hoo. The guy first used traverse teleportation, avoiding the rabbit's attack, and then he used short distance leap to leap forward, with which he cut the rabbit in half. He repeated these moves over and over again, cutting all the rabbits. He cut each of them in half, their small carcasses beginning to fall onto the road with a quiet thud. Kang-hoo's reflexes were at their best. He didn't miss a single hit. He was able to dodge and kill the rabbits. Not a single muscle on his face trembled during the battle. He remained cool-headed and calculated his every action. He walked away from the scene of the battle. Yi-rin had also told him to retrieve the commissioned item before completing the task, and then he can do whatever he wants with the rest. He stood near the canopy of the building where the boss appeared, dressed in rags and holding 2 blades, one in each hand. Yi-rin asked what he wanted as a reward. Kang-hoo said that all he needs is to receive a dungeon raid license for those with many middle and last bosses. He remembered the system window that had a second task on it, get the boss ability and assign it to himself. The eyes of the ragged boss began to glow red, and the rest of his face was covered by a hood and mask. Kang-hoo gave him a satisfied look and said, "Here comes the middle boss."